Hi, I'm Alex Lewis. Welcome to Taiwan Talk. How do you take in a city? Do you make an itinerary by looking up things to do and then just going out there and executing that plan? Or do you, kind of like Bill Bryson, the famous American author who, in his books, describes going to a city, picking a neighborhood, and just walking and just seeing what comes? If you take in the city the second way, that means you're a flaneur, a person who saunters around observing society. And that's also the concept of the magazine Flaneur. They take in a city through the lens of one street. And the magazine has been in Berlin, Leipzig, Montreal, Rome, Athens, Moscow, Sao Paulo, and now Taipei, the first city in Asia. Let's listen into the conversation I had with the editor-in-chief of Flaneur, Fabian Saul, who is explaining the concept of taking in a city through one street.
Flaneur is a magazine about one street per issue, so I guess the first assumption is that one street sounds like something quite limited. While conceptually for us it's actually a liberation, because we decided to start from one street because we believe that if we would come, for example, here to say we're going to make an issue about Taipei or we're going to make an issue about Taiwan, that you are usually confronted with a lot of pre-written narratives. So how do you start a conversation that is site-specific but skip the nationalistic discourse, basically? How do you start speaking about space? And so we decided to start from one street, to start also from what we call the fragments of the street. So this is not a travel guide. So this is an artistic collaboration. It involves many voices, and that also means that we spend a lot of time on location. And the one you were just looking at, Sao Paulo, took almost a year to make. So that also explains why it's almost like a book, basically. Yeah. And it is not... it's about one street, but the street is always the reference point. It's the beginning of the conversation. It's where we always return to. Mm-hmm. But in the meantime, there's a lot of things happening.
Okay. So a lot of things happening within the city. Can you stray? Like, what are some of the limitations that you play with? Tell me about that.
Well, so usually we just start from walking the city, actually confronting ourselves with the city. So we're not in comparison to like a journalistic approach where you would probably pre-research a lot and you would arrive and you pretty much already know everything and then you just fill the pages with what you already planned you wanted to write about. In our case, it's completely different. We arrive, we prefer to not know much, and we prefer to actually confront ourselves with the cityscape. So walking is a very initial important technique. We can speak about the name of our magazine, Flaneur, later, because that explains a bit of it. But so walking is also the method to find the street. That street choice often then is quite intuitive. It also usually reflects a certain question we have towards the space that can be also an unsettling space. It's not necessarily the most beautiful street. It's not necessarily the most happening street. It can be, the ways you get interested in the city are very different if you actually look closely. So I would say that sometimes it comes with a certain disappointment maybe on the first side for those that know the place, because they assume, there's a magazine coming and they're going to portray like the best street we have or something. Right. But that's not the
You're going to pick one street. You're obviously going to pick this one amazing street that's there, right?
Yeah, so that's not the approach, right? So we might end up choosing a street that is also a little bit of surprise maybe for locals. But that again gets us into that space where we want to be, where we can start a conversation, because all the people that we then open up this platform that the magazine is to are local artists, are local writers, are people collaborating based on that one street with each other. So
yeah. Wow, that's really cool. So how did you, so you first started in Germany, right? 2 locations, first in Berlin, then in a place where I can't pronounce.
Leipzig, yes.
Leipzig, thank you. One, yeah. And then you went to Montreal for the third one. I love Montreal, by the way. It's a beautiful city. Yeah, so how do you pick each location?
Same as for finding the street, is quite an intuitive process. Sometimes there always feels like there needs to be some sort of invitation or some sort of starting point, which usually is like someone in that place that invites us. In the case of Montreal, it was actually the Goethe Institute in that city that read the Berlin issue and the Leipzig issue, and they thought Montreal would be a great place, and that's where we started from. But in other cases, like Rome, it was, for example, completely random. We actually, until this day, can't figure out why we went there. We didn't have any substantial support from the city or from the country. We basically just pulled it off ourselves. And so, yeah, it's pretty random like that. There is always maybe a few names, a few places that we in the team kind of have on our kind of short list. Taipei, in particular, was actually one thing that struck us was that when we started speaking about Taipei or Taiwan, that a lot of people in Europe couldn't really point at that place on the map.
Wow,
they would make like mistakes. They would point at the south of Japan. They would point at the Philippines or at Thailand because they're these kind of, or even in China mainland because they're assuming that it's part of China. So there were a lot of mistakes, and it seemed that diplomatic vacuum that Taiwan exists in also to some extent creates a certain geographical vacuum where that it seems to be like a little bit of a place that in a diplomatic sense can't really be. So we thought that that's actually quite an interesting starting point to go to a place that has that implications, and that maybe doesn't come with such a pre-written imagery as well. I think most people will maybe know a picture of the 101 from like an aerial view, but have less imagery of like what is Taipei like, or so that was a good reason to come here and start exploring, really like going into the urban fabric. Yeah.
Okay. So which area, have you already chosen the area you're going to explore or the street you're going to explore in Taiwan or Taipei?
No, actually, we're still in the process of walking, and we're still in the process of meeting lots of people, talking to many people, walking a lot. There is certainly like certain elements we can speak about that I already find quite interesting. One being the certain logic of the river, the water that you can follow in Taipei. That
Riverside
kind
parks and everything.
But also the neighborhoods that are the oldest of the city that are somehow connected through the river.
Right. Mm-hmm.
We are staying at Treasure Hill Taipei Artist Village, which is part of this kind of older landscape of the city, but then also, and I'm sorry for my pronunciation, but then also the areas where if you follow the river, Wanhua and Dadaosheng. Dadaosheng is...
I butchered Leipzig, so yeah. it's hard to pronounce.
Sorry.
Yeah,
I'm learning still.
So you follow the river and you go down each like neighborhood.
Yeah, that's one of the things that happened. But then there's also kind of crossing the river, going into New Taipei City, returning to Taipei, walking all over the place. It's not really at this point not really limited to an area, but I can already say that there is definitely an interest in those old neighborhoods of Taipei. For example, when we speak about Wanhua, I find it extremely interesting if you actually go to the southern part of it. So not the temple area, which maybe is more like people are more familiar with.
Longsan Temple?
Yeah, there people are more familiar with that area. There's already quite a lot happening in that area. There's like new art spaces popping up. There's a certain element of gentrification probably also happening. But if you go to like the southern part of it, it's like structurally from like the urban fabric is still way more gritty, way more. There's more traditional markets, etc. It's a very interesting area to explore because it feels like it has never really been part of the rigid city planning that during the Japanese period happened in other parts of the city. So you can actually kind of go into a layer of what was the Taiwanese city like before that. So I think that's maybe the whole point of walking, is going into those layers. It's actually looking more at also the layers that are now maybe not visible anymore. I mean, that this magazine is dealing with obviously the urban surrounding, but also including that we can't see, but that is still traceable in the urban fabric. That's the fascination there.
So you just talked about, walking down the river and going to all these neighborhoods. What stuck out to you in terms of, I guess, like the way people live here and everything like that?
Well, I think, well, I just mentioned there's a certain rigid city planning of the Japanese period that you can also sense when you walk through certain parts of Taipei. But I felt that it's quite interesting how people use public space here. It's it's filled with fragmented individual activity and also individual economic activity, which is quite striking.
Kind of like the night market or something.
It's
right?
like, there's and changes exactly throughout the day. So you have the kind of different periods of the day where there's almost like the function of the actual city layout changes, and this rigidness that we can find is kind of melting in this kind of individual local activity. And I think that's one element that's very, very fascinating, and also the amount of individual small shops and family-run spaces and maybe improvised spaces, but also then, of course, you have the other layer of the chains, which are then kind of popping up every 50 meters. All of that also creates a layer which is maybe more the capitalistic idea of convenience. I mean, this city is extremely convenient. Yeah. Sometimes it feels like this giant like convenience store. Someone said that the other day to me. It's like a giant convenience store. That's because funny. The density of convenience stores is so high that you usually don't even have to walk a block, but because on your block will be some sort of supply of daily needs. So that, of course, implying the layer of food, which is all around us, everywhere, all the time. But that's an interesting. That is an interesting density that it creates. It is very dense. It is a very walkable city, which for us, as being a magazine that has to do with walking, it has to do with what we call this psychogeography. So basically, has to do with finding another geometry, another geography in the urban fabric, and also together with other people. So it's not just about, maybe that's important to mention, not just about us walking, but that's just the initial stage. Afterwards, we will see collaborations with by Taiwanese artists, with Taiwanese artists and locals happening based on that one street. So it will become a giant conversation about these spaces. So I think the accessibility of the city will provide a really interesting for us the ability to really work in public space and with public space. I hope that's the...
Right, okay. And what do you think of the society here? Like, how has your interaction been with the locals?
Taipei has been extremely welcoming. I can't even... how can I say? It's extremely welcoming. People are very helpful, very... they have... also an interest in working with their own city. It feels like there's a lot of cultural activity. Taipei, in comparison to its size, has a lot of the amount of things happening, the amount of exhibitions and openings and things and discussions, and the discourse is very high, and it's something we can really feel arriving here. There is... there is an interesting way also to look at Taiwan is that certain discourses are extremely progressive here, way more progressive than in Europe, for example.
Asians. Oh, really? I was going to compare it to Asian cities.
Compared to Asia. But if you look at the entire discourse around the digital innovation, for example, I would say that Taiwan, as a country that has a digital ministry, that has a weekly hackathon where like policy making, even on the national level, is being executed, or at least thought about how we can imply these like kind of new digital interfaces in a process like that. That's extremely progressive. And at this point in time, I could not imagine Germany having even a digital ministry. We just kind of go backwards in many ways in Europe. So I think maybe it has also to do with Taiwan's diplomatic isolation, that in certain ways there is an urge to progress, to stand out, to really go forward. And then, of course, this huge contrast to the more traditionalist sides of the society, which are also very obvious and which you can also both trace in the public space. So it's like there's some things where I'm extremely surprised of how far the conversation already is compared to certain discourses in Europe. And then there's other very traditionalist implications in society when we look at the role of foretelling or ghosts or other elements. And I'm personally, because it's maybe too early to tell, but quite interested to see how these two sides kind of merge together and what this kind of synthesis in the society can maybe also create.
So the angle of the first issue in Berlin was exploring the childhood neighborhood of the publisher after she lived abroad for a while, right? She's going back to the neighborhood and seeing how that's changed, right? So the second issue in Leipzig was George Schwarfstraff.
Georg Schwarzstraße? Yeah, that's a very tricky one.
Not even close. Not even close.
It's a very tricky one. Don't worry.
Okay, thanks. But you chose that street because you were walking around the city, and it kind of like spoke to you as like a dark and like with a dark vibe or something, right? And you went there. I read this in an interview. And we just talked about, just how layered and how multifaceted Taiwan or Taipei seems to be, right? You're walking around and there's a lot of social interactions that you can take in and a lot of different neighborhoods and such. Has there been anything that's stood out to you specifically, kind of like that dark vibe that you felt in that street here?
Well, I mean, that issue you were speaking about was actually one of them where the choice was quite a surprise also for locals, because it was a bit of a ghost street in the sense that street was an access to a previous idea of the city, which was like almost like a promise that once existed, that everyone believed in, that city is going to be one of the metropolises of Germany, and there's going to be all this. There were all these plans, there were all these ideas, and then the 20th century happened, and there were wars, and there were dictatorship, etc. So that never happened. So the street was for us an access into those hidden layers. I am quite well. One thing definitely here that is most striking wherever you go in Taipei is that the multitude of layers, of colonial layers, of the history of violence and exploitation, but also in the way that the idea of the city was always shaped by the oppressor in a way. There is, as I said, this Japanese idea of city planning, which was then implemented. Then you have the entire map of China mainland projected onto that in 1949 in a very rigid and in a very ignorant way also. I mean, with every new layer, and we can go back into like the 17th century to go even deeper into that. With every layer there is a certain ignorance towards the actual local context, and people are writing over this city again and again and again. So in some ways that's something very striking, very visible also, because you can see it in the names, in the structures, and in the different struggles. I feel like how Taiwanese society tries to deal with the how to piece together this different layers, how to make a story of it that is something that can create some sort of common ground. I think that's a big. It seems to be a big issue, and at the same time, I feel like it is probably almost impossible to kind of clear up that history into like a homogenic story, but it only can be possible to speak about it from many perspectives and from many different. That's hopefully also what, in a way, the magazine can be seen as a platform for like many perspectives happening at the same time. So I'm quite interested to see how this, on the one hand, you have this representational layer. It's like, what's the name of the street? What's the name of the memorial? Who is being commemorated? Who isn't, etc. Right? That's like the kind of official stuff we can read. But then there's also mythology of the place. There's people living there that have lived through these different layers, that have their experiences, that have their traumas, their dreams, their histories. And right now, because I just arrived, I'm probably more reading this more representational layer, and I'm very interested to go deeper into the mythology of the place and get in touch with people and listen to their stories.
That's very cool. So you've been all over the world, basically. You've been to, Sao Paulo, Moscow, Athens, Rome, Montreal, Leipzig, and Berlin. Did you feel like it was time to go, pick a city or street in Asia?
Well, for sure. I mean, the movement of the magazine was we started in Berlin, where we're all based,
right.
And there was also a way you can sometimes travel in your own city in a way that you travel almost like to another place. That was the case for our first issue because we picked a street in a neighborhood that I never went to, for example, and our publisher knew it, but knew it more from the perspective of her childhood. So that's very interesting to revisit. And then also you can travel within your own city, like going to like a new city. But still, the movement of the magazine then was kind of out into the world and into new places. So we kind of, you see, Leipzig is still like an hour from Berlin. Then Montreal is already like further away. Moscow is further away. And now Sao Paulo and now Taipei. But it's always also, we're always starting from scratch. It's always like a bit of an experiment as well, because there's no formula to what we do. There's just a concept, a method we try to apply, and we try to open up to people. So for sure, we thought, okay, if we really want to take this seriously, if we want to go further with this project, we can't just kind of go back into the kind of coziness of our own surroundings, but we have to, go out into the world. And then, for sure, we talked about making an issue in Asia. And then, as I said, Taipei, I think, has a multi-layered, multifaceted, is a fascinating place, and also a place that came with a lot of questions. So that's why we're here.
So let's talk about flaneur, right? I guess the definition: a man who saunters around observing society is what I got off the internet. Why does this encapsulate your magazine?
Well, actually, we named the magazine after writing the concept of this magazine, and we asked ourselves, what's that actually? And flaneur is a bit of an old term, comes from the 19th century Paris, and it is that person walking around, observing. It's a person that in some ways has access to time. It's very often connected with taking your time. So that means you go for walks that you don't know yet where they're going to lead to. Right. So that has already that kind of dark element that we were speaking about. So that doesn't mean we're not talking about the Sunday walk. It's not a recreational kind of, we go for a walk in order to feel better. No, the method of flaneuring means synchronizing with your surrounding in a way that you actually synchronize in a subjective way. So you are the flaneur in a way sees what is there, but also sees that is the things that are lost. So it's always visiting places from a perspective of actually decay. If you look at for example, if you know a certain place and you walk it again and again with a certain, not going to work from A to B or rushing into the commute or something, but actually taking your time, you notice how a place changes. The things that disappear, the things that are being torn down, and something new is built, and layer upon layer, the city changes. And in a way, the flaneuring has a lot to do with noticing these changes and noticing how things disappear, but maybe in a more avant-garde reading of the figure, the flaneur also is capable of projecting into the future, because when you know what's lost, it also creates a sense for envisioning things in public space. But so for us it was important to take this term and take it in the 21st century and try to talk about the techniques behind it more than just about the 19th century guy, but actually actualize the term. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And you approach it through art. Why through art?
Well, I think the idea of the magazine from the beginning was that if we apply such a subjective technique, we can only do that by not having just one narrator, but having many narrators. So it's a multi-perspective issue. It's a multi-perspective magazine, and so we believe that the way you express your observings can be in writing, but can also be in photography and film and dance and music and whatever you choose to express in. So that's why we thought that this kind of interdisciplinary art project is a good way to kind of take this technique, open it up to a contemporary use. And so that's through art, that's through writing, that's also through collaborating, through discussing, and so there is a multitude of kind of techniques that you will find in the magazine.
Okay. And given that multitude, how is an aesthetic chosen? Or does it kind of just come together and kind of naturally crystallize? Or
yeah, for sure. I mean, you were just saying, it comes together like naturally crystallizing. I think it's a quite good way to explain our process, because I can't tell you yet how many pages Taipei issue is going to have or how many artists are going to work there. A lot of things will happen along the way. But our art directors, the graphic designers of this magazine, they always come to the place. They always look at it very closely, collect imagery, patterns, colors, connect with local designers, local artists. In a way, every magazine is different. So we always start from scratch also when it comes to the aesthetics. Mm-hmm. So it is completely, each issue looks completely different, and it has completely different color schemes and completely sometimes different fonts and different usage. And of course, we also are a bilingual magazine, so we are English and then the local language. That also brings in an aesthetic layer, of course, that is always new. And so, yeah, in many ways, it's also reflecting the place we're in.
Where is Flaneur distributed, and how is it funded?
Well, our distribution is international, so we're like, I think, in around 40 countries in the world. It is a very selective distribution. That means we're not so much, we don't like the fact that in the magazine industry, many magazines are usually thrown away. So we try to find a model where we can actually be in the right places where people actually buy the magazine, and we will not throw copies away. So we are in a lot of museums, a lot of selected magazine and art bookshops around the world. And then, of course, with every new place that we go to, we also setting up a distribution in that country. So, of course, in Taiwan as well. And yeah, our funding, it's also quite a flaneurish thing, because we go to new places. We're looking for new partners. We're looking for a new network of people that can also fund the project. And that's something that's happening alongside with our artistic production. So there is no set. We are an independent magazine, so there is no set like investor or anything like that. But we actually set up in the new city, also in the structure and the financial structure we're working in. So that's something that's happening besides the walking at the moment as well.
So the places that you've gone, I'm going to name them again: Sao Paulo, Moscow, Athens, Rome, Montreal, Leipzig, and Berlin. Which place stands out as your personal favorite, and why? I know it's kind of like asking you to pick between your children, maybe, but yeah.
Yeah, exactly. That's how it feels like. There's certain places you kind of develop certain relationship with, I guess, that you return to. I can say that I have returned to Moscow quite a lot because it's been like, I also wrote a book actually there in the last 2 years, which. So it was like, sometimes the magazine can be like kind of key to a city, and then you kind of start coming back. The same goes for Montreal, where I regularly return to. But that doesn't mean that I don't like the others. But it just sometimes it happens that there is like certain, you meet the right people, or you feel kind of welcomed, and you kind of return and you do more projects together. And I always hope that Flaneur is that door opener, not just for us, but also for the other artists that are like collaborating, to actually create relationships that are longer than just the length of the production, but that can, can continue after we're done. Usually that happens. The same for Sao Paulo. I have to mention Sao Paulo as well, because it was an extremely welcoming place. We have we met beautiful people there that we're still in touch with, we're still working with. And I have a feeling the same will go for Taipei.
I've been to Montreal and Moscow, both those places, and I loved those cities. Especially, I was surprised that I love Moscow so much, because as an American, you, I guess, kind of believe in the propaganda, right? And it's like, it's going to be like, they hate America, and it's like, it's going to be this way. And we go there, and they're just obviously regular people, right? Of course. They're also more welcoming than I thought they would be, and Moscow is just such a cool city with so much history, and yeah, it was a fun time. It was a fun place.
For sure, but you're right. Like most of the time when I say, I'm going back to Moscow, or people are like surprised, because they imagine that Moscow is always cold, and there's always winter in Moscow, because in the Cold War films, in the American productions, always winter in Moscow.
Always, yeah.
People don't know that it's actually 40 degrees in the summer in Moscow, and it's a climate maybe closer to New York City in many ways. But then you have a lot of imagery of New York City in the summer and in the winter and in all seasons. But for some reason, we only get to see Moscow in the winter. That's why people imagine it's gray and cold, and everyone is wearing these like old hats, which no one actually wears. So
nobody actually wears those hats. So other than the old people, right?
Okay. There's an old generation that maybe does, but in general, it's very different. It's not necessarily an easy city, but it is a fascinating city, welcoming place, and I agree.
And the food was great.
Yeah. It is.
How do you like food here?
Well, that's definitely a very very obvious layer of Taiwanese society, because I feel like it's less food 24/7 around you, and it's constantly playing a role. And so I tried many things, and I'm kind of, whenever I don't know something, I kind of try it. So I really like it, and I also like that there's actually quite an interesting also mix of like different food cultures that you can find. I mean, there's the kind of more traditional local food, but then you also have all sorts of influences from like all over Asia and the world, and kind of interesting mix of different things. And then of course the different way to consume it. I mean, you can go to the restaurant and have like a beautiful like table full of small different kind of things that are shared across the table, which I always enjoy, because that's something, for example, we don't have that culture in Germany, for example, and in other places we went to, like Greece, etc. It's also like this. You kind of have things and you share. I like sharing food, so that's something. But I also like this kind of, you just walk past the night market and you just get something on the go, something greasy, fried something, and there's so many things to try and so many different methods to actually communicate. Well, of course, for me it's quite difficult, but I always try to also understand not just what's the food, but what's the actual element of communication. Like, how do you choose the food and how is it prepared? It's always a little different from stand to stand, and from like kind of, so that's really fascinating. Also part of communication here, I guess, the food. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Fabian, for coming in and talking to me.
Thanks a lot for the invitation.
Yeah, no problem. Look out for the Taiwan edition of Flaneur Magazine coming out later this year, hopefully. A big thank you to Ting for facilitating the connection, and thanks to Fabian for coming in and talking with me. That was this week's Taiwan Talk. Thanks for listening. I'm Alex Lewis.